Next, we're going to talk about cascading style sheets. Now, everything we've done thus far has been produced just by editing the HTML, adding tags where we need larger content or where we decide that we'd like a list of information, adding in an image using the insert panel. We've gone about each of these steps individually. And to some degree, we could add colors and some alterations using HTML. But as a whole, HTML all by itself to design a attractive and modern web page is limited. So this is where cascading style sheets come in. These give you the opportunity to make basic HTML look gorgeous, interactive, and modern. So if you think of HTML as basic structure, so think of it like if we were to make the analogy of a house, you've got the foundation, the walls, the rooms. The CSS is going to act as the interior design that makes that house gorgeous. The paint, the carpeting, the colors, the style, placement of furniture, pictures on the walls, etc. So CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is going to give you a lot more control over the layout of the design of your pages than regular old HTML does. Now, I'll warn you, CSS itself is a big topic. If you are in any kind of information technology or web design track for your classes, you are going to have classes dealing with CSS specifically. So I'm going to touch upon it very lightly in this course. You may explore it and go as deep down that rabbit hole as you like, but because we have a lot to cover in a very short period of time, I'm going to give you the basics, and it is going to be up to you to do that exploration if you're not getting everything that you feel that you need just based out of what we discuss in this course. So cascading style sheets. A style is basically just a rule that describes how a browser should display a particular element on a web page, like a heading or an image. That's basically as simple as you can put it. Now, when you use CSS to add a background image to a page, for instance, and I'll put a background image here, you get to decide how it tiles or repeats. HTML isn't capable of doing that. It makes it very easy to update your site as well. You could make one style to perhaps style your headers, style your navigation, your paragraphs, how images interact with paragraphs. And once you style it that single time, you can apply those styles to other pages. So theoretically, you should only have to do major styles a single time and then apply the CSS file that we will be producing to the rest of your website to simplify things. So it kind of shortens the amount of work that you have to do to get the results that you want. Now, there are a couple different ways of producing style sheets. You can have an internal style sheet and an external style sheet. I'm going to make one of each. So I'm going to, in the CSS Designer panel, and I'll go ahead and make that a little bigger just so we get the side-by-side layout. I'm going to click the little plus sign under Sources, and I'm going to create a new style sheet. And it's going to ask me to browse and tell it where I want a style from. I've not actually produced a CSS style sheet yet, so I'm going to give it a name. And I'll call it Bacon. So file name, it's going to actually save that for me in my CSS folder, and it's showing me where the URL for that style sheet is going to be located. So it's going to be in the CSS folder called Bacon to match the rest of the web page. So I'll click Save. I'll click OK. And that produces that bacon.css document, if we come up into the head portion of our HTML document, it's showing that we have linked that CSS style sheet to the document. And if you look right up here in this panel, it's showing me that my related file that I will need to be aware of is bacon.css. So that's telling me if I click here, it's going to show the CSS styles that I produce. In this panel, source code represents the HTML. So it pops up in a couple different locations. Next, what we want to do is we want to give it a selector. We want to tell that style sheet specifically what it is that we want to change and how we want to change it. So there are 3 types of selectors that you can produce. The very first one, the simplest and easiest to use, is tags. We've been using tags already to lightly style the size and shape and appearance of some of this content. So our H1 is the biggest header. Our H2 down here is a slightly smaller header. The UL for the unordered list is a tag. The LI for the list items is a tag. So every single one of these little guys in brackets, these are all tags. So a tag selector allows for me to make an alteration and style anything that has that specific tag. So if I click the plus sign here under selectors, by default, it's going to nest it for me and try to cascade that. So it sees that in the body tag, there's an H1. I'm going to double click, and I just want to worry about H1 for right now. And you'll notice once I specified what tag I was looking for, a bunch of stuff popped up over here in the properties. These represent all of the different things that you can alter with CSS. So I'm going to make some alterations to my H1. These are categorized by group. So the first group pertains to layout, and these pertain to how it would appear on the page. Because the H1 is text, I'm going to come over here and click on the text panel. I could also scroll down until I see text. So all of this section pertains to how text is going to appear. So I might center align my text. Perhaps I'd like to pick a color that is more like bacon. Maybe a slightly orange red. And maybe I'd like to change the font. It's giving me a default, which looks like a Times New Roman. I'll go ahead and click here and maybe take a look at some other font options that we've got available. These are grouped into common fonts, so if one isn't there, it substitutes whatever the next is in line. Text decoration, if I want to maybe underline it, put a strike through it. That's not what I want to do here, but I could. If I switch from design mode to live mode, there are a few additional items that I could alter. For instance, I could give the text a shadow. Let's give it a shadow. We'll say 5 by 5 pixels. We're going to blur the shadow. And perhaps I want a color other than the pinky red color. Some of these you won't be able to see unless you're in live mode. If I switch back to design, you can see that my shadow disappears. It doesn't mean it's not working, but live mode is going to show you how it will appear in a browser. So if viewed in a browser, my dancing bacon will dance. Similarly, certain effects like shadows are not going to appear unless being viewed in a browser. So live view can kind of give you that preview that you're looking for. Okay, so I've set all of these properties. If I click on Show Set, this narrows it down to show only the items that I've changed as I've made edits to the style. If I click on my bacon.css document, you can see that it has adjusted and added in each style for H1 that I've added. So the text align, the color, what font family I'm using, the shadow information. Now here's the beauty of this. This is an H2 here. If I decide, you know what, I'd like to make that an H1, you can see that I don't have to set all of those again, because every H1 using that tag selector is going to automatically be updated. So every time I use an H1, it is going to make that alteration on my behalf because there is already a style sheet assigned to that selector, H1. I don't have a selector for H2, so as of right now, that is by default. What if I wanted that particular style to be applied to the H2? I could come into my selectors, add a comma next to H1, and include H2 as well. Hit enter. And you can see it still keeps the H2 size, but now it is taking that additional information from all of these styles, and I've included more than one tag to incorporate it. So I'm able to take a style and quickly make edits to it in a way that makes it consistent and easy to add details and style and jazz up web elements. So the tag selector is the simplest selector. It is not discriminate. If I wanted to style my paragraphs, I'll go ahead and add a new selector. I'll uncheck Show Set so I get this whole content here. Click on T for text. Maybe I'll change my font family for the P tag. And I want to keep it relatively simple because paragraphs are a lot of content, so adding a shadow or anything more than a color is probably going to be overkill, so I'll leave that be. But the P tag, you can see it changed every single instance that the P tag appeared. I'll switch back to design just to simplify. So every single time a P tag appeared, no matter where it is in the screen or in the web page, it altered that. So it doesn't matter if you want a paragraph to look different from another, this is going to be the simplest and least discriminant style selector that you can make. If I wanted to get a little bit more specific, let's say I want one of these paragraphs to maybe stand out and be different from the rest. I can't just use the P tag in this instance. I would need to use a more specific selector to make that change. So this is where the class style or the class selector comes into play. So this is a style that instead of using preset tags, you come up with a name. Maybe this is a drop quote of some sort that I need to indent and I want to maybe change the color a little bit. So I will name this selector. I'll click selector. To make a class style, you apply a period before the name of the class. So I'll call this my quote. And I want this quote to have a color. I'm going to sample this red from the bacon. I click this little eyedropper tool here and it lets me pick whatever color I want. So I'm going to grab that color red. Now, even though I highlighted that particular tag, no changes have been made yet. That's fine. In order to apply that, I'm going to select the P tag in question. Down here in the Properties panel, you can see that there's a section for class. Like I said, this is a class selector. And right now it's set to none. If I select that, it tells me, oh, there's a quote option here. That's the selector that I just made. So I'm going to click it. Oh, and I see what I did here. I adjusted the text shadow color, which is not what I wanted to do. I'll just erase this to come up here to color. I'm going to do the same thing. I just picked the wrong area. There we go. Hit enter. And if I want to remove a tag, or remove a style rather, I'm just going to hit this little delete icon there. Make that adjustment. Delete my style that I didn't want. So now you can see that the paragraph I had selected is now the red. You can see that inside of the P tag, it's showing that it is a class. Editing it now. It maintained the font size. Let me delete all this extra stuff that I don't want. There we go. It's maintaining the same font that it had initially because it is still inside of the P tag, but now it's taking additional changes because it is using the quote class. And so I'll indent that a touch, which I was using with HTML. You can do it with CSS as well, but this is quicker at the moment to indent that, and now it appears different. If I'd like to, I could also uncheck this, go back to text. Perhaps I'd like the size to be just a touch larger. By default, it's set to medium. Let's go to large, just to make that quote stand out a touch more. Weight pertains to boldness. Maybe I want to make it a little bit bold for that quote. So that makes it really pop out a bit. And I think go a little bit lighter on the color, perhaps, just to make it stand out a bit more. So I was able to be a little bit more specific about what changes I was making to this section by using a class. Now I can apply a class selector to anything as many times as I want. There's no limit. If I decide, you know what, I like that, I want that to be here too, I could come to class down here and apply it again. If I wanted this section to be indented like it is up here, instead of adding the block quotes, which is what I had done initially, maybe I will add that as a style. This would probably come into play on the layout section. So what I'll do is I'll just alter the margin a little bit. We'll say 15% on the left, and 15% on the right. And you can see that it indented both sides. If I come back to show set, it shows me how that margin has been altered. That's a little too much. So if I want to take that class off of it, come down to class and just reset that to none. I could also come into the source code and just delete the tidbit that pertains to the class. And that would also update that accordingly. Now there's one last type of selector that I haven't discussed yet, and that is an ID style. And an ID style is similar to a selector in that you have the ability to give it a name of whatever you'd like. I'll go ahead. IDs are identified by a hashtag or a pound sign before them, sort of like how a class is identified by the little dot or period. But the difference between the two is that an ID selector can only be used once per page. So unlike with the quote, where I was able to make this paragraph a quote as well if I'd like to, when you use an ID, it can only be used one time per page. So it cannot be used as frequently as a class, which cannot be used as frequently as a tag selector. So IDs are best used for things that only appear one time on a page. As an example, a footer is a really great opportunity to do that. So if I want my copyright content to be styled differently, or maybe a legal notice that appears at the bottom of some web pages, an ID is perfect for that. So I'll just make some alterations to my copyright notice here. If I want to see the changes right off the bat, I'll go ahead and highlight my content. Just like there's a class section, there's a section for IDs as well. I'll click footer. I haven't made any alterations to that yet, so it doesn't look any different at the moment, but I will get on that. So we will change the color. Adjust the alignment. Even if I remove the H6 tag and just switch it to, say, a P tag, it will make the text a little larger, but I still have the ability to go in, and it still has the ID attached to it. So it's still taking on those changes. You can see when I click out of that, no properties appear. I have to select the selector that I need to alter in order to make this panel pop back up. And footers are usually small. So extra small sounds good to me. So all of these styles that I've altered thus far, these have all been done as an external style sheet, which is the easiest way for you to work, because you can apply this bacon.css document to other web pages. So this is considered an external style sheet because it's on a separate document linked to your HTML up here. Now, there are ways to add styles other than using that external style sheet. Internal style sheets, and I will come down to the properties panel down here, and you can see that there's an option called new inline style. So if I were to, hypothetically, I'll click center align right here to my navigation. It's still considered CSS because I did click the CSS section in the properties panel. If we come to that specific object that I clicked on, there's a style applied to the unordered list, and it's placed in line with the rest of the HTML. The problem with working with like this is if I, say, made another page and then applied my bacon.css style sheet to it, this style to center align that text isn't attached to the external style sheet. Therefore, if I had a copy of this page, unless I made sure to copy this chunk of information as well, that's not going to duplicate over. So it would be very, very useful and helpful to make sure that if you're wanting to include that information, just keep all of it external. I don't want to see internal use of CSS just because it does make consistency of an entire website a lot more complicated than it should be. So I'm actually going to just delete this chunk. It's going to take my center off, but that's okay. Under sources, if I clicked up here in the plus sign again, we initially created a new CSS file. If I had an existing CSS file, and this would be the case if you made an additional page to link to this page, you would be able to click that and browse and tell it, oh, here's my CSS document. There you go. The lower option, define in page, is the same as coming down into the properties panel and adding in a very simplified style here. So define in page is just going to add in a style, but you can see that it's not linked. It's just defining it in page. You're going to run into the same sort of issue. So with the exception of a link attached, there shouldn't be any inline styles because it will be more difficult to alter. However, if you do add an inline style or an internal style and add a selector, I'll do an ID for navigation, and we'll say hypothetically I do want to center my navigation bar. You can see that all of this is getting applied here. I'll click my unordered list and apply the navigation. There we go. So it's linking to it. But if you realize, shoot, I made that an internal style, I need that on the CSS document, you can actually highlight the specific bit of information that you need to alter. So I want to take this chunk of information, and I'm going to Control or Command X to cut it out of the document. I'm going to come back on over to my bacon.css, and I'm just going to paste it into my external style sheet. So you can catch yourself and make corrections. You would still want to come in and clean up some of this extra style code that doesn't need to be there at this point, just to keep things simple. But you aren't stuck if you accidentally make an internal style you can just copy it and paste it to where it belongs so that it will filter to all of your pages as opposed to just staying on this single HTML document. There are dozens and dozens, so many CSS properties. It's kind of crazy. They're categorized, so layout, text, borders around content, background colors. Here, let's give a background color or a background image to our web page here. I'll go ahead and click selector, and the body tag surrounds everything that's visible to anyone that's going to view your web page. So if I want a background image to fill the entirety of my web page, I'll delete my paragraph. I would want to apply that to my body tag. So if I wanted a background image, I could click this little button. I could do a color if I wanted to, but that's a little plain, I think. So instead, I'm going to enter a URL, or I'm going to source an image from my folder of images. So I'll click that. I've brought in some additional visuals. And I'm just going to click a bacon image. I'll click OK. You can see it does cause some problems with reading, and it does tile awkwardly. If you decide that's not going to work, it's a little too busy, we'll stick with a simple background color until I can find a more appealing image. These scrollers, you can affect color, you can affect how light or dark a particular shade is. And then this last slider is the alpha. This controls opacity. So you can actually go from being a fully opaque shade to adjust that opacity just to kind of make it a little bit paler. This can also help you set content apart by making some of it semi-transparent. Because there's nothing on my screen right now, it's not going to appear as transparent. But if I were to layer multiple items on top of one another, it would be apparent, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. This last one, more, which is after the background section, this just lets you manually type in something that you're looking for. These are all very basic properties, but there's more than what's listed here. So if there's a specific style that you're aware of that could be brought in and altered, you can just come into more and type it in manually if you can't find it in some of the other settings. Now, if you're in design view, if you're a coder and you like to come over here and start altering styles, Dreamweaver is kind of ready to help when it comes to help naming your tags. So let's say I want to add in an additional style. I'll start with my bracket, and we'll say that I want to give it to my list items. List item goes on the outside of the bracket. Once I'm inside of that bracket, we'll say I want to change the color. Typed in C, and it gives me a list of everything that I have the ability to alter. Once I click that, it gives me the option to grab my color picker, which is this guy here. But the Creative Cloud comes with a library of colors as well. So if you have a color panel saved, for instance, for future use, you can switch from here as well, and it will give you additional colors to pick from. Sometimes these are colors that you've added in yourself. This one's giving me a lot of additional options. So you can see I added it and I picked the color tomato, which is not nearly as tomato looking as I'd expect, but you can see that it updated all of my list items accordingly. So you don't have to remember specific color codes necessarily. It does have a lot of presets for you built in. I'll pick my color picker though. I'll pick a medium vibrant red, and that gives me the code that it produces. So tag hints are wonderful if you like to hand type in your work. Some students that are new to this and maybe not 100% comfortable typing by hand are more than welcome to use the properties panel, but tag hints are very useful here as well. If you're looking to create styles using the properties panel, which I think is a little less intuitive, but you can still use that down here, a lot of the same chores can be taken from the bottom. So I'll click CSS, font, certain font elements in terms of italic or bold, color, size. These can be added here as well as alignment. If I click Edit Rule, it opens up a separate window that has some of the options here over here as well. And they're grouped by what they do. So type pertains to text. Background pertains to the background color. Nothing's showing here because I have this set up for the P tag, so it's showing paragraph. There's nothing set up for that, so that's why colors aren't pertaining there. Block elements pertain to block level content, so that can be pertaining to an entire paragraph of content, so word spacing, vertical alignment, text alignment, centered. You can see it centered it there. Whether or not it displays, if I click display and say none, it hides that entirely. Now that hid all of my paragraphs, so that's a problem. So I don't want to do that. Box, this pertains to divs. Once we get to that, padding and margin I think are a little bit more intuitive here, but it is here as well. Adding borders to content, maybe I'd like a border around each paragraph. This is going to be unattractive, but I'm going to show it just to give you a visual. So you can add borders around everything. And hitting apply is going to give you visual. By checking or unchecking same for all, that lets you make each side something different or a different size or thickness. So if I decided I wanted just a line dividing each section, so top, right, bottom, left. So let's say I want one on the bottom, but nothing Nothing anywhere else. Click apply. That gives me just an underline to separate the content. List. This one's useful. If I were applying this to my list items, this would allow for me to alter how those bullets appear. So I have a few more options than I did in my HTML list item. I can control the position of how it appears, but the fun one, list style image, I could pick an icon to represent the bullet and have like a little piece of bacon for each one. I will get into that more at a later time, but you do get a lot of customization. Transitions are animations. Again, this is a little more advanced. I'm just giving you an overview, but there are a lot of opportunities. So I'll click OK. Because I applied this to I had my CSS open, it applied all of those additional items to me here. So word spacing, text align, blah, blah, blah. All of these changes are the ones that I just made using the properties panel. You can see it's gotten a little bit busy. I'm going to go ahead and just hit delete to bring that back to where we were initially, to clean it up a touch. So whether you decide to use the properties panel or the CSS designer, that's entirely a personal preference. I think the CSS designer is easier in terms of visuals. It kind of lays it all out for you right off the bat. You don't have to search. But it can be helpful for certain elements to go into the properties panel and edit your rules here. I do know that certain options, like the transitions aren't in the CSS designer at this current time. So at times it's going to be easier to come in here to make those alterations if you decide that's something you'd like to incorporate. To style non-text elements using the properties panel, and by non-text I mean pictures, like this little fella. It's a little bit different because you don't get the HTML or CSS buttons that pop up here. You do have the ability to add a class or an ID, but you don't have easy to alter buttons here to make those changes. So if you want to apply a style to an image, you would want to click it, add a selector, IMG is the image tag, and then you can go about making your alterations there or applying a class or an ID to it. Under layout with image, I'm going to use the float property. This is a wonderful property that can be applied to block elements like pictures or div containers once we get to those. All of this space around it, around the image, is being wasted essentially. The paragraphs try to just stick only above or beneath it. But with the float property, I'm going to click float left. What happens is the paragraph recognizes that it can go in that space, so it keeps the text floating around that image in a way that utilizes the space on the web page a little bit easier. It does do some weird stuff to my quote, which I'm not too pleased with, but I could just rearrange where the image is located in the HTML. One last selector type, if you want to be extra specific about how certain items are going to be edited, is what's called the cascading style. And this essentially lets you combine multiple selectors together in a way that can make content easier to style exactly the way you want it to. So as an example, if I look at my faux navigation that I've got going on here, this is not attractive. It doesn't look professional. There's bullets all the way over here to one side that aren't getting used, and the text is just sort of hanging out in the middle, but not in a way that's pleasing to the eye. Target a page element that sits inside of another page element. So if we come back to our source code and review how the list is set up, you've got list items inside of an unordered list, inside of the body tag. So if I wanted to target how specific list items appear, but maybe not affect other list items that could be elsewhere in the web page, I could say I want to only target the list items inside of the ID navigation as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and make that selector. I'm going to add new, and I'm going to target the ID, and you can see it prompts me for that. LI. So list items inside of the navigation ID. So under my navigation here, navigation, specifically the list items in my navigation, I'm under the text section, and there's an area down here for lists specifically. So list style type, I'm going to select none. And there are a bunch of different options here, but I want my navigation to not have any bullets to get me started. I also want to alter the position of each of those list items. So in order to have them display maybe in a line as opposed to stacked, I'm going to come back up to Layout under Display, and I'm going to select Inline. Now, because I've got a nested tidbit here, it's applying that in its own line. But if I want to apply all of them in a separate line, I'm actually going to adjust this, the beef, pork, poultry, fish, separately. So I'll go ahead and make a new one. And by selecting that, it's selecting, oh, you want to select the list inside of the ID. So I'm just kind of digging deeper. And I'm going to tell this to display none. It's going to hide it. It's not removing it. It's still in the CSS, but I'm going to deal with it at a later time. So you can see that that style hid the beef, pork, poultry, fish, and lets my navigation, home, about, portfolio, services, products, blah, 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 align separately. So I'll switch back to my list items. The last thing I'm going to do, and you can see when I click that in live view, it kind of puts a box around each one. Currently, it looks like sort of a run-on sentence, which home, about, me, portfolio, it gets awkward looking. So I just want to add some space between each word. So I'm going to go into my margin and maybe give each side, the left and right, maybe 5 pixels or 10 pixels of separation between each one so that they begin to stand alone like a navigation bar as opposed to looking like a sentence like what we've got here. So I've made many changes to my document here. I'm going to go ahead and produce a new web page, and it'll be my HTML. We'll call it, let's see, my about page. I'll click create, and for fun, I'm just going to copy some of my content here. Like I want my header to be the same. Welcome to my webpage about bacon. click copy, paste, oops. When you copy out of code, you need to paste into code. If you paste into the body, it's going to add all of those tags, which isn't going to do you much good, so that needs to be over here. There we go. Now you can see right off the bat that my content isn't the same. It is the same content, but it's not displaying the same way. And that in part is because we have not attached a style sheet to this content. So to add a source, I'm going to attach an existing file. I'm going to click Browse, go to my style sheet that I've produced that styled the previous page. I'll click OK and click OK, and it will automatically make all those updates and format it in a way that is gorgeous to look at. So attaching style sheets is actually relatively simple. If at any time you need to alter a style, for instance, my list items here don't match the same font that's getting used in the rest of my pages, so I could come up into font family and make that alteration at any time. So all you have to do is grab the selector, make whatever changes you want to make, whether that's color, font, spacing on the margin, any of that stuff. And if you decide you need to remove a style, maybe something no longer suits whatever designs you've been producing, I'll click Show Set just to narrow down specifically what I'm dealing with. If I decide, you know, I don't like that font after all, I can click the little garbage can, which will delete it entirely. Or if I just want to hide it temporarily, I can disable it by clicking the little circle with the slash through it. It doesn't delete it, it just hides that style. You can see here, it's still in the CSS panel, in the code, it's just hidden. And then you click it again to reveal it. To delete it permanently, you would click the little garbage can or wastebasket icon. You can also delete it directly from the code if you wanted to go that route. Just make sure that you get the full style. Click delete, same idea. If you decide you need to rename a class to be maybe more specific, maybe quote, maybe you have several quotes. So perhaps I'll call it the ham quote. Click once, double click to allow yourself to edit it. I'll click ham and I'll capitalize Q for quote just to make it easier to read, and I'll hit enter. Now I've altered this, but the problem with altering my CSS, I also have to go in and find that in my HTML because the HTML doesn't also update. So update that, and that returns the style. So you can do it, but you need to make that adjustment throughout. Same thing goes for IDs. If you wanted to duplicate a style, let's say you want to use one style as the starting point to make a new style, right click on whichever style it is that you want to make alterations to and click duplicate. And it will make a copy of it. The new one is the one that is highlighted. I would recommend maybe making a differentiation between the two so that no confusion occurs. But once that is produced, you can make whatever changes you need to make. In relation to the fonts, and I'm going to come on up here with the text. You can edit the fonts based on these presets, but I'm going to click Manage Fonts. If you've signed up for an Adobe account and you're using an account that you own, you have access to Adobe's Edge Web fonts. This is basically a newer way to distribute type that ensures better compatibility with your guests' computers. So you can pull a font off of your computer and name it and save it there based on the font file, but Adobe's Edge web fonts are an easy way to really swank up your website. So if you click any number of these, they are going to add these to the list of font families you have available to you, and they're free for you to use. So it's also helpful going this way as opposed to uploading your own, because different web browsers like iPhones and iPads require different fonts and different file formats, and unless you have all of the file formats, your website won't always display as you expect it to in regards to the fonts. Edge fonts take care of that for you. So you can specify how you want to use it, as a header or as a paragraph. I'll go ahead and narrow it down to headers. And you can also narrow it down by what types of fonts you want. Decorative, fonts that look handwritten, script, serif, sans serif. And it will narrow it down. I like this kind of chubby font here. So I'll click done. And now that one is added to the list. And you can see that it updated appropriately and now suits the rest of my page. It is important to pay attention to what those options are. Like if you wanted to make paragraphs of content, this font would be much too thick. It would take up a lot of page space, but it's great for headers. So if you want paragraphs, you might narrow it down in a slightly different manner to get something other than the default. Anything other than the default is going to be pleasing. But they have a lot of wonderful options. Also in relation to fonts, font size is an important factor to pay attention to, because unless you specify what size font you want to use, your fonts are at the mercy of whatever the computer settings of the visitor looking at your web page is set to. So unless you type in a font size specifically, and in certain instances you can see we're using the same two elements here, it's going to differentiate causing issues with my H1 and H2, but it's not always going to appear the way you want it to appear. So your H1 and your H2 may look different on your viewer's browser. So if you need it to be a very specific size, you're going to want to specify that font size for any areas you need to keep maintained at a specific range. There are a lot of options here. Obviously, pixels we understand, this is pixel width typically. Points are what you've been using in like a Microsoft Word document. Any word processing points are something you're going to be familiar with. So if you understand how big 72 points appears, that's going to be how large it'll be. Percentages, I don't recommend using. 2x small to 2x large, or smaller and larger, are arbitrary. But these are fixed sizes. Medium is typically the same as like 16 point or 16 pixels. So that's typically the default. Text indent. We talked about indenting paragraphs, and I'll actually switch over to my P tag to alter that. Indent pertains to the first line, just like a real word processing program would be. So if I put in 5 pixels, px for pixels, you can see that indented it just a little bit. Let's increase that. Instead of 5, let's make it 25. So that gives you sort of an attractive indent. You can also pick negative numbers if you wanted to. It's going to go off the screen, but you do have the ability to work both positively and negatively in relation to how the indent appears. By default, it's set to 0, but you can indent your content if that is an appearance that you're going for visually. Transferrin pertains to the case of your text. So lowercase, uppercase, all lowercase, all uppercase. It's screaming at you. I don't recommend that. This option capitalizes every single word. So I'm going to click none to bring it back to what it was initially. But if you do need to all caps something quickly, you don't have to set it up yourself by hand. You can set a style to make it appear that way. Spacing governs the space between letters. So if you want to add kind of a gap, a gap between letters to space it out a little bit, you can do that. This is probably not going to be used frequently, but you do have the ability to alter that space, but it does make it harder to read. Word spacing is similar to the letter spacing, except it applies to words as opposed to individual letters. So we'll do the same thing. It adds in additional gap. It will extend the length of your web page. So those are some basics. I do encourage you to kind of play in the CSS designer. There are a lot of styles that can be altered. Like border radius can give you rounded corners to items. So there are a lot of really fun ways that you can alter your content, and this is going to give you the flexibility that you desire to kind of jazz up your websites.